Okay, so this is System21 Workspace, obviously. I've got some shortcuts here, and we're going to raise an invoice and then run it through via an email, output PDF, and also into the document repository Docstore. And then we'll have a look at that via Workspace extensions. So we'll see that process from Workspace. And then we'll go back through and look and see how that is achieved using the tools that Cobweb provide. So I've got a shortcut here, which is raise invoices, but that's essentially, let's go and create an invoice. We have a demonstration company, so I'm going to use the demonstration customer that we all love, Reeves Chemists. Chuck in an order ref and move through. So I'm just going to chuck some numbers in here, but this is just the demo. And then we'll run out an invoice. So put some items in. Just going to add some more items in. Okay, so I've got a couple of items on my invoice. I'm going to complete the invoice. And that's generated this number here, invoice number 1187. So we'll track that through the process, but essentially we've just raised an invoice. So if we're assuming that that has now created a spool file, the spool file's been generated and collected by the Cobweb system, which is now designing the form as per the requirement, the customer format, and distributing that via email. What we're doing with that customer is we're looking up in the customer master against a document type of invoice in the customer master and pulling the email address from there. We could at the same time be looking at that customer master for a flag that says email it or print it, because obviously some customers may want to have emails sent to them with their invoices. Others may need to be printed at a specific location and then sent manually or for whatever reason, or not distributed at all. So basically in that instance, we can query a customer or a supplier master as we process that inline document. So if I'm now in the team and I want to, customer service or whatever, and I need to look at an invoice, I've got two options that we've set up here. We've got either invoice by invoice number, so that goes to order entry inquiry, or we've got invoice by customer, taking us to the same order entry, but we're actually going to be looking at invoices based on a customer code rather than an invoice number. So let's have a look at the invoice by customer. So if we put in that customer code that we were using, it brings up the list of invoices, and you can see the latest one today on the 23rd. So we've got a button here, which is essentially a workspace extension that we've put in, which is the Cobweb Docstore archive repository that we use. And if we click on that, it will go off and query that particular list and bring back all those invoices based on that customer. So essentially behind that is a URL that queries the Docstore with a particular string and inserts the customer based on the page you're on. So when you query against that customer, bring those in for that customer. So here we have those invoices. So if we select that one here, the one we created today with those two items on, it'll bring that in. You can set the default zoom level, but in this instance, that's our sales invoice. And as you can see, it's just a standard System21 invoice, single page with totals on. So that's querying against the Docstore for a particular customer. based on the list here in this particular customer, GC01. If we go back to our home page and then query by invoice number, and that was 0001187, brings up that invoice as we know, but we've also got a Docstore button here, and this URL that's set up behind this button for the extension is looking for that particular invoice number. So when we query the Docstore through the URL or the workspace extension, again, it goes to the same place. It brings up the particular invoice. So obviously across Workspace and System21, if you develop a strategy using Cobweb to design and deliver your documents into the Docstore repository, the archiving tool, then you're able to set up extensions wherever is relevant to your customers, their users' workflow, so they can retrieve individual documents or a list of documents. And obviously once they have that document in front of them, they can download it and email it out. They can save it locally and email it if they require to do that, or just reference it on the screen. So that's an example of generating a sales invoice using Workspace, and then retrieving that via Workspace extensions that have been set up in the screen menus that are required by the customer. And obviously across many document types, you build up a much more efficient way of accessing historical documents that you may need to look at. So how do we do that? How, you know, what's the methodology behind? Because obviously we are printing or emailing, but we're definitely archiving those. So I would imagine, Barney, you've received a couple of an email into your inbox.
Yep, should we take a look at that?
Yeah, if we just nip across and have a look at that for the time being. If you want to share your screen there, thank you.
So we've got two emails in here. We've got Business Bionics from Business Bionics with the latest invoice attached. We've got others there that we've been using to test the system earlier. If we open up the email, we can see it's got your latest invoice PDF attached, and it's got a thumbnail of that. This text in the message body is fully configurable, as is the subject. Let's have a look at the PDF, and there we've got the PDF file that was in the Docstore attached as a PDF in the email. Just a couple of points here. The subject is completely configurable, and it's dynamic from information held either in System21 database or on the Spool file, or it can be hard-coded, as can the message body. The message body can also be plain text or HTML. And then we've got the attachment, and again, the attachment name, the PDF name is fully configurable from information from the Spool file from the System21 database, or can be hard-coded. So there's the email in my inbox. If I go back to you, Matt.
Yep. You can also choose to CC, BCC, and send the email to multiple recipients. So you can burst it to multiple people. Okay, so let's have a look. How's that done? So essentially, if I take you now to what we call the Cobweb Designer, on this screen here, you can see an example of a spool file in this left-hand or center pane, as you can see it here. On the right-hand side, we have an example of the overlay with the text. And as you can see, if I zoom in there, you can see areas where we've copied essentially information from the spool file which is column line, field length and height, and put them in the position on the output pane. We've also chosen to change fonts at this point, so we can select different fonts that we wish to use on the document, whether that be a bold font for a heading or a standard font. In this instance, we're using Helvetica, which is a typographical font that we chose for the document. So we get a spool file in, and we query an AS400 output queue or library, and we're looking to edit import spool files. So we're going to look at an output queue library, user data, and we log on to the system, and it will query that output queue, and we can pull in that spool file. So here's a list of spool files. So I'll pull this one in, and I'll add it to the spool file pages on this document, so we can then toggle through and see all the different spool files. And that's obviously, this one I've brought in here is a report page, so it wouldn't actually be relevant to this design. But here we have a standard System21 spool file, and we've mapped the information to the output pane on the right-hand side here. On the left-hand side is the logical process that we follow every time we process a document. These are images, and we're going through copying across information and making logical decisions on whether we pick up information off the document using conditional statements such as, is it equal to, not equal to, greater than, or less than. And we run those tests on the spool file in a logical way in order to account for information we wish to copy across as part of the document design, or omit information. It's at this point that we can also go back to the System21 database using APIs to query that database and pull in additional information. You mentioned earlier on about 250 modifications or changes to the a customer of yours data. Well, this is typically where Cobweb gets involved in terms of print file modifications on uplifts to new versions of Aurora or their chosen ERP brand that's on System I, and we get involved by using these APIs to take key fields from the spool file and retrieve that data, thus reducing the needs for the modification in the print programs. And in essence, that's still very much a key part of Cobweb's functionality within the customer base, to be able to not only distribute and provide that back-end retrieval and support, but also to be able to add that data and modify the document. So we've designed our document, and at the end of the logical process down this left-hand side, we're actually going to output it via our email, which is defined here within our email output device. And this is where we can choose to select HTML and the from email, etc. And also into the document storage repository, which is set up in here. We're obviously able to specify key fields that we want to index the document with, and that assists us with retrieving the document. As we saw within Workspace, we were retrieving based on the invoice number, and that was what was behind the Workspace extension. And so in this instance, we obviously need to make sure we map that particular field and archive the document with that key field attached to it for retrieval purposes. So when this document has been designed, we export it, and it resides on the AS400 as a member in order to process these set of instructions that we've encapsulated and set up in this file against the spool file that's created when a user creates it. So if we go on to the AS400, we can have a look at how we pick up that spool file. I'll just go to the Cobweb menu and we'll have a look at what we call the spool file monitor. So out of System21, you'll be creating a spool file that will go to an output queue. Cobweb monitors those output queues, and we then look for particular spool file attributes, which is the file name, the user data. And when we get one into that output queue, we pick it up and we process it against that set of instructions, that member that we've deposited on the AS400 from our CPPD designer. So we're monitoring for that data queue entry on that output queue and picking up the spool file and processing it. When that particular spool file comes into the output queue, we've picked it up and we've processed it, and we've sent it to the Docstore, and we've also sent it to an email. Now, on the Cobweb system on the AS400, we do have an email queue, and that is for an audit trail, so we can make sure that the audit trail is consistent for all documents, business documents that leave the business. So this is the email queue, and we also replicate that within the browser, Docstore browser solution. We also have the queue there in a browser-based format. So we've created our document and we've emailed it, and let's have a look at the Docstore. So if I go to the Docstore here, you'll see that we're essentially going to a browser URL that's the server domain, server name or IP address and the port number. That brings us to the CPPD web server home screen. This is the web service that comes as part of the product and is accessible by all users via their AS400 login. Obviously, if you're running within Workspace, it deals with the single sign-on, so you're logging in. When you log into Workspace, it automatically logs you into the web service for Cobweb. And then those Workspace extensions would essentially pull up queries and just bring the documents in within a web page in the Workspace environment. However, we are looking at the native CPPD web browser or web service, where the logo here in the left-hand side is fully configurable if required to be the customer logo. So we have two options. As a standard user that I am at the moment, I get the option of looking at the message queue, which is where we look at our emails. And as you can see, I can see those emails, the list of emails here. And that is configurable in terms of filtering based on ones that have been sent, ones that have been queued. So if I submit with the sent ones, you can see the ones that went out today, this morning. So that's the message queue, but we're interested in looking at the Docstore here. So we go to the Docstore, and if you imagine a Docstore being a repository for a number of documents of different types, or a document storage for invoices only, you can configure as many Docstores as you want, and within there you have document types. So if we go into this particular one, if we can see that I can then look at what invoices or documents I've got in here. So it could be accounts receivable, accounts payable, it could be manufacturing, you could have different ones, or they could all be in the same repository. But we're dealing with company invoices, and I can search on invoice number, customer code, or invoice date, because that's what we have currently indexed invoices with in this example. However, you could have a number of different key fields. It's not just limited to 3. So again, I've also got this option here where I can click on individual document types, and we only have invoices set up, as we just mentioned. If I go to that, I've also got a tab here which allows me to upload documents into the Docstore from other locations. So it's not just exclusively there for the repository for System21 generated documents. You can actually also upload documents from a Windows location, for example, and you can specify the key fields that you'd like to index those documents with. You also have the capability of leveraging against the security on the System I, where you can add authorization lists and public authority so that you're able to specify who can access, who can view, who can alter different documents if the requirement's there. So if we go back to our basic search, I'm just going to search without any criteria in there. So it'll bring up all the documents that are in that Docstore for invoices. And in this example, it brings us the same view that we'd expect to see in Workspace, a list of all the invoices. So that's the native browser. If I click on one of those, obviously we get that consistency. We see the sales invoice come in here. And that's the same view as we saw in Workspace.